Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you had a good day yesterday. I hope you enjoyed the teaching we had from Brother Gossett last night. If you didn't have a chance to watch it yet, you should go back and watch it. He's closing out the Tabernacle series and talking about the brazen altar. Today's reading is Joshua chapter 7, 8, and 9, and then Proverbs chapter 9. And I've already done a couple takes of this. I'm not going to be able to talk about all 4 chapters because there's too many interesting things to talk about, and I don't want to take your whole morning. But chapter 7 talks about the loss of Israel to Ai. Chapter 8 talks about the final success of Israel over Ai. And then chapter 9 talks about the deception of the Gibeonites. I really wanted to talk about the deception of the Gibeonites, but it might have to wait for tomorrow if I don't get to it in time because it's fascinating to me and raises a whole bunch of questions I don't have answers for. But anyways, the first thing I want to point out is in chapter 7, it's interesting to me. The Bible doesn't give us tons of detail. It's not a military history textbook, but notice that Israel doesn't lose because they're fighting and the fight is going so badly that they have to retreat. They lose because they run away at the beginning. Only 36 people die, which obviously any loss of life is lamentable, but out of an army of 3,000 to lose 1% doesn't seem like a reason to run away right at the beginning of battle. And so the Bible, the words it uses is that they fled before the men of Ai. And yet God attributes this loss to the sin of Achan, to the sin that's in the camp. And look at the parallel between Joshua 5:1 and then chapter 7, verse 5. In chapter 5, verse 1, it's describing the people of Jericho in anticipation of the Israelites. Their hearts melted. And then in chapter 7, it's talking about the hearts of the Israelites after their loss at Ai. The hearts of the people melted and became as water. So what happened when they allowed sin in the camp and they broke their covenant with God, they lost the presence of God that allowed them and helped them to be bold and courageous, right? That's what God had been telling them since the beginning of the book. Be bold and courageous. Because this isn't a people from a long military tradition. These aren't warriors by upbringing, right? These are the sons and daughters of slaves coming from Egypt. They've been raised in the wilderness. And so here they are waging war, and God is encouraging them to be bold and courageous. And they were at Jericho, but when they disobeyed God and allowed sin in the camp, he removed his presence, and they were not at Ai, and they fled before the battle had really even been waged. And the whole heart of the people melted following that. I mean, you can imagine, okay, we won at Jericho, but here this little town has defeated our warriors, and how are we going to, anyways, it really, it strikes me because this reminds me that sin destroys. And what Joshua says in verse 12 is that it's because of their devotion, it's because of the people's devotion to destruction that they cannot stand before their enemies. And that's interesting the way he doesn't just say it's because they disobeyed God or it's because they took things they shouldn't have taken. Because it wasn't idols that they took. It was what Achan took was a robe and some silver and some goods. But the Bible doesn't talk about it taking idols. But he took things that God had earmarked for destruction. And what Joshua says is that in that action, the people have devoted themselves to destruction. So he's making it a bigger thing than just because they took stuff they weren't supposed to, but because they were devoted to destruction. And it makes me think this is the way sin is. This is the way disobedience to the word of God is. Sin destroys. That is what the enemy uses sin to do. That's what it does in our life. It is death. So when we allow sin into our lives, we allow the assassin of our hopes into our lives. We allow the agent of death into our lives. And a lot of times, we don't think it's a big deal. We do things that, because our culture endorses them, that are against the Word of God, and we decide, it's okay. But what's happening is that we have invited death into our lives by knowingly disobeying the voice of God. We're allowing the enemy to have a foothold in our mind, and sometimes we go up against things that we should be able to handle, and we don't even fight. We give up without a fight because when the mind is unwilling, it doesn't matter how strong your arm is. And when we've allowed sin into our lives, we rob ourselves of the courage that comes from knowing that we're on the right side, that we are in the right place with God. And so that it just struck me. Now, what's interesting here too is that if you remember from chapter 6, God had explicitly told them not to take anything except for the precious metals, and that was to be God's. But in the beginning of chapter 7, you see they were allowed to take the spoils of Ai, the livestock and the spoils of the city. So if Achan would have waited and done it God's way, he would have had what he was looking for anyways. But because he took it into his own hands and disobeyed the word of God, it turns out very differently for him. And this is one of those things I don't know exactly why Jericho was not to be spoiled and Ai was allowed to be spoiled. One thing you could look at is it's maybe a symbology for tithes. The first fruits go to God. The first city that they conquer when they enter the promised land is the spoils of that city are either completely destroyed or given wholly over to God. That would be one explanation, but the Bible doesn't explicitly tell us what God was thinking here. But we see that at Jericho, they were not to take of the spoils. At Ai, they were allowed to take of the spoils. So one thing this kind of reminds me is we have to be careful not to think that God is capricious or that he's just doing things because of a whim. God is purposeful, and God sees a bigger picture than we do. And if anything, I like to say the last decade of my, but really all of my adult life where I've been aware enough of the world to be watching, has really hammered home to me that we humans have no idea what we're doing. We do our best to plan, but it seems like no matter what issue is facing our society, you've got people on both sides, and both sides think, well, if we go your way, it's going to lead to total and utter destruction of our civilization. And both sides are just yelling at each other that the other side's idiots. And really, if you take the time to stop and listen with an open mind, both sides have points. Like, I can see the concerns of both sides. But the truth is, we pass laws with good intentions that lead to bad results all the time. And sometimes you can anticipate, say, I told you so, we shouldn't have that. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes everybody thinks this is a good idea, and it turns out to be a horrible idea. But because we don't have a grasp on the complexity of ourselves and of our society, it's just too much. But then we look at God and we see a situation like this in isolation, and we're presented just a picture, and we feel like we know better, that what God did was unjust or not fair or something. And number one, our value system is probably not right. Number two, how can we possibly think that we know the right answer? I mean, how can we possibly think we know better than the all-seeing God what is right and what is wrong? Anyways, I've already gone longer than I meant to. So do your own critical thinking on chapters 7, 8, 9, and then on Proverbs. And we could continue this conversation into chapter 8 about what happens when they do take Ai. And then, like I said, I think the story of the Gibeonites is so interesting. I'll probably have to talk about it tomorrow because it runs into chapter 10. So I'll talk about that tomorrow because I want to. It's fascinating. Anyways, I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope that you can wage the battle in your mind and not let the enemy discourage you from doing what's right, discourage you from living right, because if we're on God's side, if we do what God has asked us to do, everything else will fall by the wayside. The land is already promised. God has already done the work. He's already made a way. We just have to walk in his way, and he'll take us through to conquer the land. I love you guys, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.